All right, day 28, the church and the denominations. You probably notice I've got the board out today because I think there's some things that we can use to illustrate this principle that will be helpful to us as we think about the nature of the church and denominationalism. Of course, the first passage I think that needs to be examined is Matthew chapter 16 and verses 16 through 18. Now the context starts back in verse 13, where Jesus asked his apostles, Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they answered, Some say you're Elijah or Jeremiah or John the Baptist. You know, Herod thought he was John the Baptist come back from the dead, or one of the prophets. And he said, But who do you say that I am? And Peter said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say unto you that you're Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell or Hades shall not prevail against it. And so Jesus says here in this text, I will build my church singular. My church singular. All right? Now, in other places, for example, throughout the Scripture, the church is described also as a body. For example, in 1 Corinthians 12 through 27. Other passages that are companions to one another. Ephesians 1, 22 and 23, and Colossians 1 and verse 18. He is the head of the body, singular, the body, the church. And in one more text, it's described as a marriage. Christ is the husband and the church is the bride. And the most well-known text in this respect is Ephesians 5, 23 to 33. And in this particular text, there are 12 nouns and pronouns that are used to describe either expressly or implicitly the church. So sometimes it says the church. Okay, so that's obviously a reference to the church. Other times there will be pronouns such as that he might sanctify it. Well, it would be a pronoun that this is a pronoun for the church. The church appears in this verse, and then in the next verse it's described as it, which is a pronoun, but again it's referring to the church. And of these 12 nouns and pronouns, also all 12 of them are singular. They are all singular. And singular, we understand, means one. There's one body. Ephesians 4 and verse 4. As with regard to marriage, there's one husband. There's one wife. And so the Bible speaks extensively about a singular church. Now, beyond that, the Bible speaks with regard to individual congregations, but also speaks to them as a church. Okay, so we have what we call congregations are identified also as a church. Or sometimes you'll find the phrase churches. All right, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 2, you'll read about the church which is at Corinth. The church which is at Corinth. But on the other hand, in Romans 16 and verse 16, Paul says, Greet one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ salute you, or greet you. And so you have the word churches here and church here. But the one thing that has to be understood is this. this has to be understood, is that when you see churches, they are not different churches in the sense that people think about churches today. They're different congregations of churches. In other words, whenever Paul says the churches of Christ salute you, however many churches he's talking about, they all believe the same thing. They all teach the same thing. They all practice the same thing. They all worship the same way. They're all organized the same way. They all teach the same plan of salvation. In other words, everything about these churches is identical except for their location. And so when you read in your New Testament, you read, for example, the churches of Christ, or the churches in Achaia, which is a region. In other words, there are groups of churches. Or Paul and Barnabas went back and strengthened the churches. He's talking about individual congregations, not different groups that believed different things. Okay? Because our lesson this morning is about the concept of denominationalism in comparison to what the Bible says about the church. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and erase this. Just you can write those down. If you don't have them, I can give them to you. I can give them to you later. The concept or the idea of denominationalism was unknown for over 1,500 years. Now there is a slight exception to this that I'll illustrate for you. In the first century, there was the church. No matter where you went, you found the church, and you found again people that believed what you believed, taught what you teach, practiced what you practice, worship like you worship. Organized like you're organized, and so those things were the only thing that existed in the first century. Right? It took over 1,500 years. It took over 1,500 years for the system of denominationalism that we all have known all of our lives to come into existence. Now, prior to that, there was what the Bible describes as the great apostasy. All right? And the apostasy manifested itself in what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church. Now, within Roman Catholicism, there eventually came to be two groups within Roman Catholic. Roman means it's centered in Rome. Catholic means universal, the only church. It's a universal church, and obviously church is here. Right? Now within the Roman Catholic Church, there was the church that was, the power center was in Rome. And then in Turkey, I don't even know if I'm spelling this right, but in Constantinople, which during that time was Smyrna, all right? And so you had two major groups within Roman Catholicism that eventually divided in about the year, I think it was 1072, about 1072. And this group was known as Roman Catholicism. And this group was known first as the Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox. And these individuals rejected the Pope. They rejected the idea that the Pope, but Eastern Orthodoxy has its own version of the Pope. And they thought at the time that they should be the center of the church because the church, because the church was more aligned with this part of the world than with Rome. Notwithstanding, you have this division, all right? And so you have Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism. These groups still exist, obviously. And so, but there's a sense in which this does not qualify as denominationalism. Because now we have to define what denominationalism is. Denominationalism is the idea that there are different groups within the one church. That there are different groups within the one church. In other words, their idea of the church would be this: that this circle, not circle, oval, represents the church. Right? And within this church, you have Baptists who are a circle within the circle, Methodists within the circle, Presbyterians within the circle, Lutherans within the circle, or any other group that you might think about. In other words, they're all separate, but they're all still inside the circle. That's the concept of denominationalism. I've always rejected the idea that Roman Catholicism was denominationalism because Roman Catholicism does not believe this. I mean, I have their books. I have a copy of their catechism. They do not believe this. They believe, just like we believe, that there's only one church. There's only one church. The Eastern Orthodox, they believe that there's only one church. Now, both of these sides have softened in the last 75 years and are more open to accepting one another as being brethren. But not these groups, you see. And so that's why I don't consider Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox to be a denominational concept, because they don't believe in this concept. And to me, this concept is vital to understanding and being a part of denominationalism. All right? And so denominationalism is different groups. They can have different doctrines, different organization, different plans of salvation, different leadership. They can have all different kinds of things, but as long as we all love God, and as long as we're all trying to do our best, we're all going to heaven, but we're taking what? Different route. We're all going to the same place, but we're all taking a different route. Now that's the essence. That's the essence of denominationalism. Right? So, but the Bible does not teach this. All right, so I'm going to erase this. The Bible does not teach this. I'm going to hold on to this 1,500 years. In the 16th century, which would have been in the 1500s, you have what is called the Protestant Reformation. And it's usually attributed to Martin Luther. In 1517, Martin Luther, who was a Catholic priest, wrote down 95 things that he found wherein the Catholic Church was not in agreement with the Scriptures. And these were called the 95 Theses. And he nailed these 95 Theses He nailed these 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg, Germany Catholic Church. And from this point, Luther attempted to reform Catholicism. He didn't want to start a new church. He wanted to fix the one that he was a part of. That's why it's called the Reformation. To reform a thing is to take a thing and fix what you have. Okay? And so the Reformation started. By the way, Roman Catholicism was not having this in any shape, form, or fashion. Luther was condemned as a heretic, excommunicated, all right, kicked out. But in Germany, his ideas caught on, and the Lutheran Church was formed as a result of Luther's Reformation. It was never Luther's intent to start another church. His own writings are very, very clear about that. Some of the things that he found particularly troubling, for example, was the sale of indulgences. That the Roman Catholic Church sent their priests out and about in an attempt to raise money, and you could pay money ahead of time and receive forgiveness for sins that you hadn't committed, but you planned to commit. That's what the sale of indulgences is. Right? All your massive cathedrals in Rome were built on the sale, largely by the sale of indulgences. But what it was is that you could pay a Catholic priest on Friday for sins that you intended to commit on Saturday and receive indulgence to commit that sin. That was one of the things that Luther found troubling, and rightfully so. But from Luther's Reformation, or Luther's movement, there began to be men such as in 1536, you have John Calvin, who wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion and founded what's called, what we know as Reformed theology, the Presbyterian Church. And then from that, you have in the early 1600s, you have a man by the name of Smythe, and I cannot think, for the life of me, I cannot think of the other man that worked with him. But out of these came the Baptist Church, Calvin, the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church. And then once this thing got started, then groups broke off of groups. All right? And this is how this all came about. But I want you to understand, what we see around us, religiously speaking, in comparison to the New Testament, is very new. I mean, you say, well, this has been going on for 500 years. That's true. But for 1,500 years, nobody knew anything about this. It was unthinkable that people would consider that there would be differing groups within a larger group, and even though we disagree on just about everything, we're all still in fellowship with one another, and we're all still going to heaven, taking different roads. Okay, so that's why I said it took 1,500 years for this thing to start, and now the result is that there's about 10,000 different groups in the United States that are all claiming to be the church that you read about in the Bible. About 10,000. Now, the actual number is far higher than that, but the reason I use a lower number is because, and really it's probably not 10,000. And the reason I say that is, I think that they count every independent group as a denomination. In other words, if somebody built a church down here, on the property next to my house, but it had no affiliation whatsoever with any group, they would probably count that in that number. But to me, that doesn't represent a denomination. It's just a non-denominational or undenominational group. But yet they would still have the same mindset. They would still have the same mindset as this group. In other words, we're not affiliated with any of those groups, but we consider that all those groups they're all saved people. But they do their thing, and we do our thing. Probably the newest phenomena with regard to this idea is a cowboy church. I'd never heard of cowboy church till about 20 years ago. I don't know how far back cowboy church goes. All right? But I doubt that it goes back as long as I do. And so you're talking about we'll put. There's no C's up here, are there? Okay. We'll put a C in here. All right. And at some point in time, somebody might come up, with biker church. There's biker church. And so. But again, we do things our way, but we think everybody else is okay too, even though they don't do things exactly the way that we do. All right, so this is the essence of denominationalism. Now, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say about? Well, we'll say, what does the Bible say about unity and religious division? So we'll start with John 17. Open your Bibles to John chapter 17. I realize I'm not spending a lot of time in the book. If you want to read the book, that's fine. I'm not going to tell you anything that's contrary to what you're going to find in the book. I just think my opinion is, I just think this is an easier way to teach it. You've got the book. Now, what we're getting today is a supplement to that. Okay, so what does the Bible say about religious unity or division? All right, in John 17, and I'm going to say we're going to start in about verse 9. We'll start in verse 9. Jesus is praying for the disciples here. And by the disciples, I mean the apostles. And he says, I pray for them. I do not pray for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours, and all mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I am glorified in them. I got to keep going here. I'm looking for verse 11. It says, now I am no longer in the world, but these are in the world, and I come to you. Holy Father, keep through your name those whom you have given me, that they may be what? One. And then what's the standard? What's the comparison? One what? As we are. Now, who's the we? It's Jesus and the Father. He's praying for the apostles. He's praying to the Father for the apostles, that they, the apostles, may be one as we, you, Father, and I, are one. So that was the unity that the apostles were that was the benchmark for unity, right? One as we are. Question: did Jesus and his Father believe the exact same thing? They did. And you know why we know that? Because Jesus said that the things that he taught didn't originate with him, but they came from his Father. John 12 and verse 48. He who rejects me and does not receive my words, he says, my words, has one that judges him. The word that I've spoken, the same will judge him in the last day. For I have not spoken of myself. In other words, this didn't originate with me. But what my Father has told me to speak is what I'm speaking. All right, and so Jesus attributes his words to the Father. So we know that Jesus and the Father believe the same thing. So now the apostles are what? Believe the same thing, right? All right, so now let's jump down to verse number 20. It says, I do not pray for these, the apostles alone, but also for all them that shall believe on me through their word, that they may be one. As you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they may be one in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me. Apostles, 17:20. Other believers. What's the standard? One. The command is one. What's the standard again? As we are. So all believers are to be one. Just like the Father and the Son. The standard for the apostles is the standard for us. Is that right? Shake or nod. That's what Neil would say. Shake or nod. Neil. That was Winfrey Clark. Winfrey Clark was shake or nod. Neil was, are you with me? Are you listening? All right. So you have this standard of oneness that the apostles were expected to uphold, and then Jesus prays the exact same thing for all believers and holds them to the exact same standard. Now, let me ask you a question. You remember the oval here, right? Can you get this out of this? No, you can't. You can't get this out of this.
You can almost go as far as to say, well, you can say that to be an actual true believer, you have to believe that. Just simply saying believe on Jesus doesn't work. That doesn't work. You have to believe in the one.
All right. Are y'all following what John's saying here? In order to be a true believer, in order to be a true believer, not a professed believer, but a genuine believer, you have to believe this.
You have to.
Yeah, you can't believe this, because if you believe this, you can't believe this. And this is the Bible, and this is not. So in order to be a true believer, you have to believe in this principle.
The principle.
You have to believe in the principle, and you have to pursue it. You have to believe in it and pursue it. And so you can't get this out of this.
And in pursuance of that, you can't propagate the other.
That's right. You can't. Yeah, you can't.
There's no juggle.
There's no juggling. Yeah.
There's no arm around. There's none of that. Can't be. Can't be, because it ruins the one.
It ruins the one. Now, let me just take a quick side note here, based on what John shared with us here, and that is you cannot attempt to uphold this if you believe this. All right, and the reason I mention that is there are a lot of movements or groups that try to say, hey, we're all on the same page. You know, like, look, National Day of Prayer. You know, in National Day of Prayer, you get this, right? Pretending to be this. Is that right? On National Day of Prayer, or see you at the poll, which is a school thing, or you know, whatever unity movement there might be out there, what you get is this, pretending to be this, but it's not, is it? It's not this. There was one, man, it's been 25 years ago, there was one called March for Jesus. It's kind of popular around here. And some of our brethren participated in it. Haskell Sparks was holding the flag up front. I knew that name would mean something to Lynn and Sheila. That's why I mentioned it. But you have this pretending to be this, but you can't, because what happens on Sunday?
They all go to their different.
They're back to here, right? No, you don't get to ignore all the differences for 3 hours and call it this. It just doesn't work. All right, now just a couple other passages. All right, in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. Now look, admittedly, this statement is given to a specific congregation. Okay, but it still applies beyond the scope of the congregation. Because this is still true, whether it's speaking to a congregation or if it's speaking to a group of congregations. So 1 Corinthians 1:10, Paul says, I beseech you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all what? Speak the same thing. That there be what? No divisions among you, but that you be of the same, perfectly joined together. Perfectly means completely. Perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment. Does that sound like that? It does not sound like that.
We actually strayed away from what was prayed.
Sure. I mean, can you get attend the church of your choice out of this? No. By the way, B.J. Clark always had a great example of this when he had a great sermon on the one, has a great sermon he preaches on the one church. And he said, can you imagine somebody in the first century saying, attend the church of your choice? It's like, what do you mean by that? He said, it'd be like, and here's how he always illustrated. He said, he'd take his watch off and he'd set it on the lectern. And he'd say, now you just come up here and you select whatever watch you want. He said, well, wait a minute. What do you mean select whatever watch you want? There's only what? There's only one watch up here. He goes, and so as foolish as it sounds to select any watch you want when there's only one, the idea of attending the church of your choice is equally as foolish and unbiblical because there's only one. There's only one. Only one so far as what the Bible. Yeah, we understand. Yeah, there's lots of churches. There's a lot of them. But there's only one in the Bible. And our responsibility is to find the one in the Bible. By the way, jump back to John 17 real quick and look at verse 20 again. Because I'm going to invoke a principle here that I'm going to invoke a little bit later on, Lord willing, in my sermon. In other words, sometimes the Bible tells us why God is teaching us a certain thing. Does that make sense? Now, sometimes the Bible just says, do this. Or sometimes, but sometimes it tells us why we should do it. Right? In John 17 and verse 20, in verse 21, what's the last line in that verse, in verse 21? Begin with the word that. If you have the word that in your text. That the world may believe that you sent me. What's Jesus saying? He says, you got to be this so that the world will believe that the Father sent me. That the world may believe that the Father. No, you see, he gives us a reason. Now, it's not the only reason, but he's showing us how important it is to the world for us to be one. I gave you this example not long ago on What's Jake Paul's brother that's got the podcast? Nobody under 50 is going to know the answer to this. Luke, do you know who it is? Thank you, brother. Logan Paul. He has a podcast. It's called Impulsive, right? Impulsive. All right. And he had on Cliff Connect. I think that's how his last name is said. He's the street preacher that you see, all the older dude, the street preacher that you see. He goes around campuses and just engages people all the time. All right? And he's pretty good at what he does. But Cliff was on Impulsive with Logan Paul. And here's what Logan Paul said to, we'll call him Cliff because that's what everybody calls him, Cliff. Here's what Logan Paul said to Cliff. He goes, I'm just not sold on this Christianity thing. He says, because I look around and I see so many different groups. And I ask myself, how can I know which one's right? He says, because there's good people, essentially there's good people in all of them. I mean, those are his words. That guy's an unbeliever. He's an unbeliever. And he struggles with the idea that he should embrace Christianity because he sees thousands and thousands of different groups all professing to be following the same teacher. You know, Jesus is our teacher. He's our rabbi. He's our master. You have all these people claiming to follow the same master, and yet their footprints aren't very close to one another. And Cliff swung and missed in the worst possible way. You know why? Because Cliff believes this and not this. You can go back and listen to it. It's early on in the podcast. And by the way, they got them segmented now. You can scroll through it and it's got them titled by topic through the course of the podcast. It doesn't take you long to find it. But Cliff believes this and not this. Therefore, he had no answer for Logan Paul. He didn't touch top, side, or bottom of Paul's question because he couldn't. Because he doesn't believe this. He doesn't believe this. What did Jesus say? Be one as the Father and I are one, so that the world will believe that you have sent me. Imagine the power, the testimony, the witness, if you will, if every single church building in this county was filled with people who all believed the same thing. By the way, you wouldn't even have to get rid of them, would you? You wouldn't even have to get rid of them. Isn't that right? In fact, they'd all probably have a lot more people in them if they all believed. I mean, obviously, you could combine some, make it easier, more financially, reasonable. But what kind of testimony is it to the world if everybody believes the same thing? Well, let me ask you a question. What happened to the church in the first century so far as its growth was concerned? Did it grow? Did it ever? Did it ever?
It grew in spite of being persecuted.
Thank you, John. That was the very next line. In spite of being persecuted, it grew. It swept like wildfire across the entire world.
But that oneness, going back to that oneness, the apostles were brutally, savagely murdered except for John.
Right.
In an attempt to squelch this.
That's exactly right.
All you got to do is renounce. And we won't boil you in water, crucify you upside down,
right,
skin you alive.
Yeah, all you got to do is just say, I'm not down with that anymore.
Yeah.
They wouldn't do it.
We all just get along.
They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it.
That's the oneness.
That's the oneness.
You're supposed to be looking for.
There's a phrase, and I don't remember where it came.
That's what Logan Paul should have been doing. He should have been looking for it.
But you think, look, and I'm not making an excuse for him, but you think about a guy who doesn't have familiarity with the Bible, and he's going to pick up this book. Is that the first or second? All right. He's going to pick up this book. If he picks up my Bible, it's got 1,148 pages in it. You know, he's going to be like the eunuch. How can I except somebody help me? And Cliff didn't help him because Cliff couldn't help him. There's an old statement going back to exactly what John said a minute ago. It says, the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the kingdom. In other words, everywhere people shed their blood for the faith, the kingdom continued to grow. Or it might be that the blood of the martyrs watered the seed of the kingdom. Something to that effect. Right? So we see how important this is. All right.